Okay, hello everybody. Welcome to the Commoning, as our session is called. Can you hear me in the back? Good. It has the title Commoning because we wish to stress it as a verb, as a force of action, as an activity, rather than as a resource. My name is Peter Linebaugh. I am a people's remembrancer or historian by trade. I just retired from 50 years of teaching in American fog factories or universities, and 20 years at the University of Toledo last May Day. Looking back, it's been a somewhat suffocating experience. So I've really been moved by the people who have spoken with such urgency about creating new kinds of, becoming new kinds of human beings. And this certainly includes me. I felt a special bond towards the youngster who was teething, Marina's child, because we both have a red bandana. And mine is special to me because it was given to me as a present last January in Chiapas. George and I went to the Escuelita Zapatista. Who else here has been a student at the Escuelita? Oh, wonderful. I think both George and I wish to stress that experience at this conference, both as an alternative to capitalism that's actually existing, and as a place of commoning. So that's why I wish to begin with that Escuelita. It was a place without proletarians and capitalists, without money to speak of, though there was money, and there's certainly a small commodity sector. And I worked at my age in the mountains, I like to call them, and in the forest, helping to pick coffee beans. And I was really anxious to be a good worker, because my idea of that had come from the US and also from its left-wing variant, the Staccanovite. But everyone was pretty laid back. And in fact, we had a wonderful break where one worker among 30 of us, his name was Yanni, we spoke about the commons of coffee, the recuperated land, why it wasn't very good coffee, the difficulties of selling it, of getting a good price, how the money was distributed to the collective, to the caracol, and to different families at this ejido, or this community. I mentioned this experience because it came back to me this morning when I woke up, and I felt really moved, emotionally moved again, and it reminded me how my whole self had changed as a result of that experience for me. And I went with my daughter, Riley, and another comrade from course, we were supported by comrades here. But I thought of it in light of the last comment from the comrade from Argentina, that the conversations we're having are taking place around the world. And for me, this conversation about the commons, about the commodity, about the state, is taking place in this collective coffee bean picking thing that was, for me, utter paradise. When I say for me, I mean because of my white hair. It was some life, tremendous life, of a kind I hadn't seen ever before. When I came back, my compañera and I, Michaela Brennan, went to hear Marion Kramer and General Gordon Baker speak at Ypsilanti. I'm from the Midwest, from Michigan. And I hope later today to tell Claudia from Argentina about the hearings we've been having, organized by the Midwest Radical Cultural Corridor. Hearings, we've now had 4 hearings in the Midwest, St. Louis, Iowa City, and Dayton or Yellow Springs last week, putting on trial or having a hearing preparatory to an indictment against Monsanto. Thank you. Thank you. The enclosers of the seeds and the destruction, as I understood the presentation, of a good part of Argentina, not to mention other parts of the world. The hearings were democratic assemblies of producers, that is farmers, consumers, public health people from Dayton. It's one I went to. And yeah. So I wanted to bring that news to New York City and to you. I think the alternatives to capitalism require an indictment of capitalism. And it's at this point that I would like to teach you a poem that you probably already know. But let's have a go. Are you willing to do this?
Yes.
Can I hear something more affirmative, please?
Yes.
Oh, thank you, thank you. Okay, it's the law locks up the man or woman who steals the goose from off the common, but lets the greater villain loose who steals the common from the goose. You got that? I'll say it again and hear it for comprehension first. The law locks up the man or woman who steals the goose from off the common, but lets the greater villain loose who steals the common from the goose. Now, we'll do it together. The law locks up the man or woman who steals the goose from off the common, but lets the greater villain loose who steals the common from the goose. Bravo! So now we must say, stop thief. Stop thief. This is not yet a poem, but it's the beginning, I think. If you have that poem in your head, I believe, I'm hoping, it will act as a it will help inoculate you from separating the struggle for the commons from the struggle to open prisons. You got that? These two go together. The struggle, you can't have commons without also understanding classes or class struggle. And I hope that that anonymous poem that you all recited with such vigor and comprehension will help us with that. good start. Now what? I've become quite self-conscious. As I said, I'm just a teacher and one who needs to learn. This is why I went to see a real commons in Chiapas. In Morelia was the Caracol. And I went because I want to, for so many reasons. I'm just gonna say it. I haven't thought it all out yet, but I want to. You know the Anthropocene that they're talking about? Have you heard of the Anthropocene? Yeah, it's this general, it's the sixth extinction. I read Elizabeth Kolberg's wonderful book on the sixth extinction, and it got me interested in geology. I never took it as a study, but I'm so interested. Now, why was I saying that? The geology, the sixth extinction that's coming upon us. Oh dear, I'm losing it here, right in front of this New York crowd. They talk so fast and remember all their points. Yeah. Well, no, to me, it's extinction, or it's the term Anthropocene got me stumped. That's what makes me forget about everything, because I don't know the geology. I'm not persuaded. So I went to the Royal Society Philosophical, whatever it is, founded in the 1650, Transactions of the Royal Society, to read the chemists and the Dutch and the other specialists on this. And they date the beginning of the Anthropocene, that is, the intervention of human beings in the chemical, biological, and geological processes of Earth. They date it in 1800. And if that is not the year I'm so interested in, they say that's when the Industrial Revolution began. But I think the Industrial Revolution is a misnomer. It makes, just like the Anthropocene is a misnomer. The Anthropocene is a misnomer because it's not the coal miners who put the CO2 in the air. Is it the coal bosses who do it? Well, it's a class relation, isn't it? So shouldn't it be the Capitalism? I thought that is such a... I think that's truer because it's been a class society. And the workers have not had a chance to talk about in an assembly with some power about the modes of transportation or how much concrete to produce. So this is a problem. So that's the problem with the Anthropocene. The problem with the Industrial Revolution is that I think it hides the vast enclosure that took place on the land, in the manufactures, in the family, in the mind, in 1800. There is a particular gang of four. Patrick Colquhoun. Do you know him? Anyone? Founder of the London Police, the Armed Police. Patrick Colquhoun. Arthur Young. Do you know Arthur Young? Of course. The capitalist scientist of enclosure of land. Do you know Jeremy Bentham? Yes, okay, good. I wonder why that is. I'll have to figure that out. You know Bentham because of the prisons, perhaps, or utilitarianism. And then of the gang of four, who am I missing? These are all theorists of enclosure in 1800. Arthur Young, Patrick Colquhoun, Jeremy Bentham, and who am I missing? Yes, Malthus, Thomas Malthus. Thomas, there's not enough room for you at the table, Malthus. That was in his edition of 1803. Our structures of thought arise, in part, from the utilitarianism, the agrarianism, the police science, and the factory specialists, the the mechanizers, the heat engine thermodynamics of 1800. That's why I go back to the Industrial Revolution. Well, I go back because I'm a historian, and as my partner would say, I'm much more comfortable with dates then than since. I mean, there is an element of us where we do escape from the present into the past. But having done that, then it's our duty to bring that past back to the present. So that Industrial Revolution I'm putting to you hides this vast, multifaceted enclosures. And it was partly, I wanted to see how the experience of different forms of commoning in Central America and in southern Mexico affected the commoning of England, Ireland, and Scotland in the 1800s. That was one of my purposes in going to Chiapas with the Zapatistas. I wanted to see whether it was possible and what evidence we could find to show the continuity of the commons that so thrilled me and my comrades at the Escuelita. How deep was this, historically speaking? 100, 200 years? Did the 20 minutes get up already? Oh, it's going? Okay. Take a couple more minutes. Okay, I'll just say one other thing. I'll say that the USA is a temporary political phenomenon. The USA, just dating from 1791. It has a termination date. And also capitalism, not just from a geological perspective, but from a historical perspective, also has a beginning, and it's going to have an ending, and we are part of it. Its beginning required the destruction of the commons. Its abolition requires its recuperation. Ta-da!
Thank you very much. I'm really happy to be here. I'm very happy to be here because many of the political questions that I've been thinking about, been trying to break through certain limitations and struggles that I've been involved in, have been dealt with here by many voices, and I'm hoping that my contribution here could lead to some further clarification for us all. I wanted to speak about the commons and about which is a term that has become very important in our political life in the last 10 years or so. And I want to speak about a division within the commons, a kind of a growing sense that when we speak of commons, we speak of more than one thing. And that's, I think it would be important for us to examine this kind of growing division and understand it, because the commons is, I think, very important. As Peter says, if you want to understand the notion of the end of capitalism, you have to understand what a necessary condition for capitalism is. And one of the necessary conditions of capitalism is that the workers have no access to the means of production and subsistence. And so therefore, that's a necessary condition. So therefore, the denial of a necessary condition, if workers could have access to the means of subsistence and production, therefore there would be no capitalism. It's a very simple piece of logic that is really quite important for us to understand. So it's a sort of method for us to recognize how in the moment of imaginative weakness we can rely on our logic to tell us what happens if we want to see the end of capitalism. one way of doing it is by reuniting producers with the means of production and subsistence. And in historical terms, this reunification of producers with the means of production and subsistence have been through the form of the commons. It's been a very important part of the way in which workers have been able to resist the exploitation that comes with labor for capitalism. In other words, if you have access to the means of production and subsistence, you won't have to sell your labor in order to get those things. That's a fundamental breakdown of capitalism. And so I recognize, and it would be very important for us to recognize, that this is a permanent condition of capitalism. It's not something that happened in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, but it's just the logical condition of capitalism throughout. It's not only for its origin, but also for its reproduction. This separation must be kept up. So, so we can establish that the commons is a very important part of our understanding of the existence of capitalism. And the question that is very important for us, and in a way it's been asked again and again today and yesterday, is it possible for the commons to be on the same social level as the state and as capitalist corporations and firms? Can there be a commons that shares the same rights and privileges as the state and capitalist firms and corporations? This is something that has been very important as a point of discussion in the commons world, in the world that uses the notion of the commons. And one thing that is we learned in Chiapas a few months ago when we went is that the Zapatistas have definitely a very clear view on this matter. For them, it's not possible for the commons to be part of a society that has the state and capitalist firms as other elements in the social system. It's not possible. And I just wanted to bring some other voices from the mountains of the Mexican southeast. And to hear their voices, I'll read you some parts of pieces that were written by Zapatistas to deal with the question of what is autonomy. In other words, how is it that you can live independently of state and what is sometimes called the market. And let me read you some and hear their voices. When we began to organize ourselves in resistance, we formed our authorities and organized ourselves to work together as villages, regions, municipalities, and even at the zone level. We worked collectively in the milpa, cultivating beans, raising livestock, and growing coffee in order to strengthen and exercise our autonomy and to facilitate our authorities' work in each center, region, and municipality. To resist does not mean not to work. To resist is to work because resistance is made and constructed by the people. That is, resistance is our house, our roof, our shelter, where we are together as villages, families, and compañeros and compañeras. Let me hear another voice. Thus, the bad government would destroy our economy. Why? Because, as we know, it exists in our hearts. When political awareness is mature, when political awareness is not weak, we can keep moving forward collectively as men, children, women, and elderly, all working together. And the sense of the hostility of the state is very clear from the Zapatista point of view. As the Zapatistas say, the politics of the bad government is to put an end to life in common, to community life, so that you leave your land or you sell it, and if you sell it, you're screwed. Now it has a different name, a project called Mesoamerican Integration and Development Project, because the Puebla-Panama plan was highly criticized. But it's the same thing. They only changed the name so they could go on individualizing the communities to put an end to life in common that still exists. So the awareness of the contradiction of life in common with the state in Mexico is very clear. And the idea for the Zapatistas is that this autonomy from the state and from capital is something vital. It's life. Because without that autonomy, it's death. So this is really, from their point of view, a conception of the commons that is totally antithetical and antagonistic towards the notion that society can be made up of three sectors that can cohabit with each other and cooperate with each other. A common sector, a state sector, and a capitalist market sector. This is really from the Zapatistas' point of view, not a viable, logically not a viable possibility. But there is, in the world of the commons, a conception of commons that is that conceives of the possibility of common sector having an equal share in basically the social light with the state and with the capitalist firms. And this view, this conception of the commons has been around for some time. The notion of a commodity-producing commons is a rival notion that is now being studied, that are now being used all across the world. And because the idea is that it's quite possible to use the cooperative powers that are required in having a commons to work not for the protection of the members of the commons against capitalism, but in fact to be used to develop capitalism. To develop, and this has been especially developed, this conception has been especially used in the development of what is sometimes called the knowledge economy. And the idea that in contemporary production, sometimes called imperial production, there is the possibility of creating a world where the producers have their means of production in hand and have cooperation, not necessarily with people next to each other, but through the internet with people all over the world. This conception has been seen as a way in which commons-type relations of production could become more efficient for capitalism, and is, in a way, a method by which the powers of the commons can be used for the development of capitalism. Now, these two views, the one that I've attributed to Zapatistas, and the one that I just described now, the notion of the commons as a form, a power of production in the knowledge economy, is now playing an extremely important role in the geography and the economy of the world. At least certainly the South American world, the Latin American world. In a way, what we see is that, for example, in Ecuador, the government of Ecuador now, under the leadership of Rafael Correa, are conceiving of a plan, a social development and capitalist development plan that would use the commons and the freedom of and openness that commons type production develops could really spark a way of leaping over from extractive type of capitalism, which is largely what is here now, leaping over the industrial phase into the knowledge economy. And this is a conception that is in fact being put into practice right now. There's a development of what is called the City of Knowledge in Ecuador with quite substantial government funding that is meant to use the intellectual powers of Ecuadorian workers, as well as calling upon the international scene of workers and theorists of the commons to come to Ecuador and be part of this process. Now, this conception of the commons is a very powerful one right now, but in fact, it's clear to me and to many others that the conception of the commons that is being used in this current developments in the form of production that is often called knowledge capitalism, cognitive capitalism, is that in fact there's no reason to believe that this form of capitalism is going to be offer the possibility of the end of capitalism. It seems to me that this is a political, not only a dead end, but of course, but something much more dangerous than that. So I'm bringing this, and I'm finishing up in a minute. I'm bringing this this division in the commons to your attention because there's something that we need to work on right now. And I've heard this, maybe not with the same words, I've heard this similar problematic being posed again and again in the last 2 days. And thank you for organizing this, this very important conference. Because we're going to have to think about these issues of co-optation that has been brought up again and again, the possibilities of dealing with the state and dealing with capital, and somehow tricking the state and tricking capital into basically being leapfrogged over. Okay, so with that said, I look forward to talking right now and later on at the, oh, just one thing. There is a show of Zapatista posters as in the Interference Archive. All right, are you familiar with the Interference Archive? Many of you are. But on Thursday, May 29th in the evening, starting at 7, there'll be a salon to celebrate the 20th anniversary of the Zapatista uprising. And on Thursday, June 12th, between 7 and 9, all these are taking place at the Interference Archive. There'll be a film screening of Corazon del Tiempo, which is a film that deals with the Zapatistas. I look forward to hearing your ideas, and let's go.
Okay.
Okay, well then you'll have to
Sure. Oh, it's working. Thank you both for some very interesting talks. I wanted to see if I could invite you to comment on something I feel I'm observing in the Irish context in relation to the financial crisis that's ongoing there. And I've been trying to look at popular culture and popular cultural representations of the Irish financial crisis in Ireland with a view to trying to track down some vectors of subjectification and, you know, the training of desire in Ireland. And one of the things that doesn't surprise me, of course, is that, you know, reality television in Ireland does preach this kind of Gordon Gekko kind of mindset, you know, like internal vigilance with the self, you know, sort of I must be entrepreneurial. But one of the things that, I mean, that doesn't surprise us, but one of the things that did sort of surprise me looking at this in relation to what you guys are talking about is the sense of responsibility that is being foisted on the people to find their commoning laborer within, so to speak, right? This idea that it's not actually enough to be Gordon Gekko. One must also, in being entrepreneurial, remember that one is not selling a product, but one is selling a relation. And those who fail in the Irish austerity economy aren't just failing themselves economically, they're failing the nation, right? There is this call to arms to engage in caring capitalism, and in a way it's a kind of a backdoor recognition of what the Irish financial crisis actually is a collapse of in the first place. I mean, it's a collapse of belief in some ways, right? It's a collapse of affect as much as it's a collapse of capital. At least that's how I think one can interpret the way these reality television shows preach to people. You know, so open your little grocery store in the corner, but remember your customers' names. You know, build relationships with them and get them to like you. This lionization of the effective laborer is I think, an incredibly potent aspect of financial crisis responsibility in a country like Ireland, where we must remember that nobody's really protested, not like Greece. You know? They've accepted it. Thank you.
There's that question over here.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I had a question, because we opened up the panel saying that commons are an activity and not a resource. And I was just wondering how that relates then to thinking of commons, the state, and the market as antithetical to each other, which I believe in a lot of ways they are in the relationships that are formed and the ideas and the ideology and the practices that are formed. But the question is really, if you hold the idea that they are antithetical to each other, what are your views on basically strategies for transformation or paths for transformation, if they are completely separate from each other? If any social relationship can be separate from each other. So that's really my question.
I would just love to hear a little bit more about, a little more concretely about how the governance and structures of the commons, using, I guess, the Zapatista example, since you put that out there, operates in a way that has the necessary means of governance and management without simply on a mini level reproducing some of the worst aspects of the state. So what is it qualitatively about their model and the model of the commons as we seek to govern that is qualitatively different? Obviously it is, but if we could just articulate that more, then the worst aspects of what we see in the state.
Yeah.
I'm not sure I'll surprise you, but I suspect I'll surprise some people in the audience by saying I completely agree with you about this cognitive capitalism nonsense. But of course, we have to understand that a lot of this has arisen out of the left. This is a very strong piece of the autonomista argument, which takes off out of this phrase in Marx about the general intellect and works back. And it's extremely dangerous because it picks up, I think, some extremely well-meaning people who believe that this is a way towards democratization, that it is possible to construct out of this an ethical capitalism. I just don't believe that's the case, and I think I'm very glad you've raised it in the way you've raised it, because I think this is a very important issue which is facing us right now. And since I'm working a bit down in Ecuador right now, I have to confront it head on. And it's, on the other hand, I'm not 100% sure I'm right, so I want to have a discussion with the leftists down there who are into this and see what comes out of it. But my gut instinct plus everything I've read so far would be very much in support of what you're saying. I'd like to echo the question which just had though. It seems to me it's a little misleading to suggest that the Zapatistas are just commoning. They had a military apparatus which was very well organized and still have a military apparatus, which is one of the reasons they've managed to maintain their autonomy. The military apparatus operates in a way which is rather familiar to anybody who understands military apparatuses. And we can't kind of say that it's some Shangri-La where there is no hierarchical kind of, organization. They organize themselves in villages and communes and so on, so there is a structure of governance. And I think that therefore there is something there which, if I look at it, I say it looks a bit like a kind of a good state, and I noticed that the thing you read to us about the states, the bad state, which suggests that there may be a good state, and is it possible to construct one?
Governo is not what they have anyway.
What?
Governo, which is the word they use,
Is not the state.
No. Well,
We use it. Okay, well, we'll see.
We'll see how. But some system of governance has to be devised.
Yes.
And,
In fact,
and what is it, and how does it look, and what is its structure? Because that's what we learn from, rather than kind of saying they don't have a state, or we make it,
Okay, yeah.
You got it. You know.
Story.
shall we pick that around?
Are you done, David?
Yeah, for the moment.
Somebody in the back.
Hello. Thank you for actually speaking on this topic. I have a question. It might be a little bit didactic, but I'm an urban planner working in New York City, and recently I've been kind of given a project kind of exploring the idea of the civic commons. And of course, when we say civic commons, it has a different meaning from the commons, and when we say commons, we mean all sorts of things. And this project specifically looks at kind of our spatial ideas of the commons, whether it's the public square, the library, the kind of classic neoclassical architecture of what historically has been visualized as the commons, in the U.S. context at least. And my question, kind of the goal or the mission of the project is to really think about how we support the commons or the civic commons within this day and age, and that involves a neoliberal system, capitalism, a complicated urban planner, kind of trying to relegate with these issues. Anyone else?
Can I ask one more? Are you?
Where are you? Oh, there you go.
Hey, I guess I personally define the commons as a collective life support system, which is inclusive of the relationships and the networks, social networks, but also in city context and urban context comes to housing land and other real resources, which we need to survive. I've been working this year with a group called the Cooper Square Committee, a few blocks away from here on 4th Street, who for 50 years have been struggling to maintain community control of housing resource, land resources, and other resources. And through working with them and hearing the stories of the long-term activists and people in that struggle, I've come to really respect the role that individuals, strong individuals, play in enforcing the capacity of the collective to protect that common life support system, the collective life support system, which is inclusive of the housing and land. I was wondering if you could maybe speak, you mentioned some stories or some quotes from individuals, but I'm curious to hear what you think about the role of the people, certain people, in fact, being the binding agents of the trust that allows us to do these kind of collective shared wealth projects.
No, it's, I didn't want to get into this, but church and state, priests and professors, political education. I've heard this quite a bit, it's been an undercurrent here. We have a job to do. We have a job to do, huh? I think, to explain alternatives to capitalism, to convince ourselves. So I think the role of individuals and like yourself is quite important in this. We have a propaganda job to do. Maybe I shouldn't say that. But we have to educate ourselves. I think this is also a message I got from Argentina and from Greece. We must educate ourselves, and part of the education of that clinic in Greece came from the prisoners. Some of the education from Argentina, came from the sweeper. So, what am I? Yeah, we must educate ourselves about this commons, and I don't want to talk about the commons in relationship to television. Okay, I didn't understand those references to the Irish person. I have great reverence for the Irish forms of commoning, of Rundale and the Clachan, and its persistence in County Mayo, for instance. And I think one thing I didn't mention earlier, and I think is important in is that the commons is both local, it survived by invisibility, and now it is coming out, and it is sovereign. That is the proposition I think that we need to assert. In discussing sovereignty, we are discussing governance. Yeah? And as we build commons, build that community with those networks in meeting our subsistence needs, we will discover that sovereignty, which is always in a struggle. I guess these could be commonplaces, but I don't think so. I think now, when George says we're at a turning point in this worldwide discussion about commoning and the commons, it's time for us to remember that the commons has the anti-capitalist commons of subsistence for all has very deep roots. Deep roots, not in the romance of the primitive, but in the evolution of governance, of government. I don't need to speak just of the four freedoms, or of liberty, equality, fraternity, or the Committee of Public Safety, or the Emancipation Proclamation, but I would like to mention Magna Carta, the Charter of the Forest. These are among many human documents of the legacy, of our legacy, that has recognized the subsistence commons and has tried to protect it throughout a very long period. And we must recover that and build from it in this current crisis. And I think this is happening. In, well, Argentina, Greece, and Chiapas have been what we've mentioned today. And I also want to make a distinction with the, quote, civic commons. I mean, these are some very tricky words here. So far, if you're close to the ground, and here's where it is important to talk about resources. It's important to enter the factory. It's important to be on the land, to understand that commoning is not just a social relation, it's also a material relation. So it's not just architecture in the public square, it's also how are the seeds obtained that produce the sustenance found in the public square, found at the farmer's market. So I think as we look over human history, or just the history of the so-called USA, or the history, of the European states, that we recover this knowledge of agrarian, manufacturing, and community commoning. And only by that recovery, I think, can we avoid another trap, which is to say that the public realm and the commons is the same. They're deeply different, because the commons has always, at its root, had the identity of reproduction and production.
Yeah, there are a lot of very fine questions, and I don't know if I can do justice to all of them. Thanks, Peter, for responding to a number of them as well. So let me try to say just a couple of things about the Irish question. The nationhood, has often been a way in which the emotions that are and the practices that are connected up with the commons have been used and have been basically allowed to create illusions and falsehoods. Because we know that in a capitalist state there is no commons and there's no commonwealth. But these conceptions have become very, very useful in the period of the nation state. And it's often appealed to. And these emotions are really quite deep. And it's hard to somehow liberate ourselves from them, because they're the emotions that are connected up with common and cooperative work and being able to share one's life and with others. These are very important values and aspects of the commoning process that are hijacked again and again. And the reason why they can be hijacked again and again is because they're so deep. So, as with Peter, I have great respect for the Irish forms of commoning that have managed to survive one disaster attack after another. Okay. Now, there was a question concerning the antithetical character of the commons and how can it operate. And here I think, Peter's story about, or point about the locality is very important. We have to take the commons one step at a time, because different commons have different ways in which they can create a space for themselves and be able to defend themselves. And some of them are through invisibility on the one side, and another side has been to be able to expand, as with what happened with the Zapatistas. They're very important. And it's interesting that in the literature of the commons, the Zapatistas rarely show up. But as far as I'm concerned, what they're doing there, which deals with more than 100,000 people, hundreds of ejidos, and a territory that is perhaps as close like a small U.S. state, is an example of how commons can be ratcheted up, can be scaled up. And it's very important for us to study what is happening there, because I think it's a very important, as they would say, world historical experiment. If it fails, I think it's going to have a big bad consequence for many of us around the planet, not only Mexicans. But if it succeeds as it has been doing now, because when we went there, the thing that we saw were the children. There were children and there were young men in the ejidos. The children haven't been shipped off, and the young men are not disappearing into the American border, the U.S. border, or into Mexico City. So these are very important ways in which one can understand how a commons of today can survive and begin to expand its powers. Because, in fact, those children now have developed from '94 on. They are the children of the revolution, the uprising. They have been, their political discourse starts with the Zapatistas. Now, I don't know whether it will end there.
We have to move on.
Okay. We have to move on. Okay.
Can we give a round of applause for our two speakers?
Okay, thank you.